The Moon Festival was meant to be Genevieve's grand debut, a night where destiny chooses its mates. Instead, she was shoved into the shadows, a forgotten daughter in a tattered gown. But fate has a wicked sense of humor, especially when the terrifying Alpha King decides to rewrite the rules. The kingdom of Ethelgard was a harsh. Within the sprawling medieval lordship of Oakhaven, the House of Stirling had ruled for centuries. Lord Arthur Stirling had been a fair and just Alpha. But after his tragic death during the border wars, the light in Oakhaven was extinguished, replaced by the suffocating grip of his widow, Lady Beatrice. Beatrice was not Genevieve's mother. She was Arthur's second wife, a woman of icy beauty and razor-sharp ambition, hailing from the lesser house of Croft. When Arthur fell, Beatrice wasted no time in seizing the reins of the pack. By pack law, the leadership should have passed to Genevieve, Arthur's only true-born daughter, upon her 18th birthday. But Beatrice had other plans, meticulously woven with deceit and dark apothecary secrets. For 3 years, Genevieve lived as a ghost within her own ancestral castle. The vibrant, fiery-haired girl who used to ride alongside her father was systematically broken down. Beatrice relegated her to the drafty, stone-walled servants' quarters, stripping her of her silks and replacing them with rough-spun wool. But the physical degradation was nothing compared to the biological warfare Beatrice waged against her stepdaughter. Genevieve's wolf, once a promising, restless spirit beneath her skin, had fallen unnaturally silent. In the werewolf hierarchy, a wolf that could not shift by their 18th year was deemed a runt, a cursed omega unfit for leadership or a worthy mate. Beatrice weaponized this, whispering to the pack elders that Genevieve was defective, a weak link that would invite rival packs to slaughter them. The truth, however, was far more sinister. Every evening, under the guise of strengthening tonics, Beatrice forced Genevieve to drink a bitter, dark brew prepared by the castle's corrupt apothecary, Gideon. It wasn't until 3 days before the Grand Moon Festival that Genevieve discovered the truth. She had been tasked with scrubbing the stone floors of the apothecary's tower. Hidden beneath a wooden work table, she overheard Gideon arguing with Beatrice. "The dosage is too high, my lady," Gideon had hissed, his voice trembling. Continuous ingestion of refined wolfsbane root will not just suppress the girl's wolf, it will slowly destroy her nervous system. If the Council of Alphas finds out we are systematically suppressing a pure-blood alpha heir— "They will not find out, Gideon," Beatrice had snapped, her silk skirts rustling against the stone. "She only needs to remain suppressed until after the Moon Festival. Once my Priscilla is chosen as a mate by one of the High Lords, or perhaps even the King himself, our claim to Oakhaven will be indisputable. Genevieve will be cast out as an omega, and no one will question it. Keep brewing the tea." Crouched in the shadows, Genevieve pressed her soot-stained hands over her mouth to stifle a gasp. The betrayal burned through her veins like liquid fire. She wasn't defective. She was being poisoned. For the next 3 days, Genevieve poured the bitter tea into the potted ferns in the servants' corridor. The withdrawal was agonizing. Her body trembled with cold sweats, and her bones ached as if they were being splintered and reforged. But beneath the agony, something ancient and powerful was clawing its way back to the surface. Her senses sharpened. She could smell the pine needles in the forest miles away. She could hear the guards whispering on the battlements. Her wolf was awakening, and it was furious. The Moon Festival was the most sacred event in the medieval werewolf calendar. Held every 5 years at the capital, it was a sprawling, opulent gathering of every pack in the realm. It was a political summit, a grand feast, and most importantly, a mating ground. This year, the stakes were unimaginably high. King Silas Blackwood, the Alpha King of the Northern Marches, was rumored to be attending. Silas was a legend, a warlord who had united the fractured northern territories through sheer, brutal dominance. At 28, he was unwed and unmated. He was known to be ruthless, cold, and entirely uninterested in the sycophantic daughters of the southern lords. Yet his presence meant that every noble house was desperate to parade their daughters before him. Beatrice was no exception. She had drained Oakhaven's coffers to commission a gown of spun silver and crushed blue velvet for her biological daughter, Priscilla. Priscilla was beautiful in a highly manufactured way. Her blonde hair curled tightly, her scent heavily perfumed with rose and jasmine oils to mask the sour, petty nature of her wolf. On the evening of their departure to the capital, Beatrice found Genevieve in the courtyard, loading trunks onto the carriages. "You will accompany us, Genevieve," Beatrice commanded, her eyes narrowing as she looked at her stepdaughter's pale face. "Not as a guest, but as Priscilla's lady's maid. You will carry her trains, you will fetch her wine, and you will remain out of sight. If you embarrass me, or if you dare speak to any of the lords, I will have you whipped and thrown into the dungeon before the night is over. Do you understand?" Genevieve kept her eyes cast down, hiding the sudden, unnatural amber glow that flashed in her irises. "I understand, stepmother." She would go to the festival, but she would not remain in the shadows. The great hall of the Ethelgard Palace was a masterpiece of medieval architecture, its vaulted ceilings disappearing into the shadows, illuminated by hundreds of floating iron chandeliers ablaze with wax candles. Massive hearths roared with oak fires, casting a warm. The air was thick with the scent of roasted venison, spiced mead, and the overwhelming, complex pheromones of hundreds of werewolves, mingling, assessing, and posturing. Genevieve stood in the narrow, shadowed corridor, designated for servants, just behind the grand pillars of the main floor. She wore a drab, high-collared grey dress, her wild chestnut hair braided tightly and pinned flat against her skull to make her look as plain as possible. Yet, despite her appearance, she was struggling to contain the overwhelming energy vibrating beneath her skin. With the wolfsbane completely flushed from her system, her wolf was practically hurling itself against the cage of her ribs. The sensory overload of the great hall was dizzying. She could smell the anxiety of the lesser lords, the arrogance of the highborns, and beneath it all, she could hear the distinct, cruel laughter of her stepsister, Priscilla. Priscilla stood near the center of the room, surrounded by a court of fawning nobles. She looked stunning in her silver and blue gown, but to Genevieve's newly heightened senses, Priscilla smelled of desperation and stale perfume. Beatrice hovered nearby, her eyes darting toward the massive oak double doors at the far end of the hall. They were waiting for the king. Suddenly, the heavy blast of the ceremonial horn echoed through the chamber. The lively music played by the court minstrels ground to a halt. The low murmur of the crowd died instantly, replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. The double doors swung open, and King Silas Blackwood entered. He did not walk. He prowled. Silas was a towering figure, broad-shouldered and battle-hardened, moving with the terrifying, lethal grace of an apex predator. He wore no crown, only a heavy tunic of black leather embroidered with the silver wolf of his house, and a dark fur mantle draped over his broad shoulders. His dark hair was swept back from a face that looked as though it had been carved from granite. A jagged scar crossed his left eyebrow, a testament to the brutal wars he had fought. But it was his eyes that commanded the room, a piercing, icy grey that missed absolutely nothing. The pressure of his alpha aura slammed into the room like a physical shockwave. Even from the servants' alcove, Genevieve felt the urge to bare her throat. Several lesser wolves on the floor actually dropped to one knee, unable to withstand the sheer dominance radiating from him. Silas was flanked by his elite guard, but he waved them back, stepping down onto the main floor alone. The high priest of the moon approached, bowing deeply before offering the ceremonial goblet of mead. Silas took it, drank, and handed it back without a word. The ritual was complete. The king was now officially participating in the festival. Beatrice seized her moment. With a harsh nudge, she propelled Priscilla forward into the king's path. "Your Grace," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she curtsied low. "May I present my daughter, Lady Priscilla of House Sterling. It is a profound honor to welcome the King of the North." Priscilla fluttered her eyelashes, tilting her neck to display her throat, a submissive invitation that was as blatant as it was desperate. "My king," she breathed. Silas stopped. He looked down at Priscilla with an expression of profound boredom. He didn't even bother to take a deep breath to catch her scent. To him, the overly perfumed, simpering girl was no different from the dozens of others who had thrown themselves at his boots over the past decade. "Lady Sterling," he acknowledged, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that sent shivers down the spines of everyone within earshot. He prepared to step around her, eager to speak with his generals by the hearth, but as he shifted his weight, a sudden gust of wind swept through the high, open archways of the hall. In the servants' alcove, Genevieve's breath hitched. A sudden, sharp pain lanced through her chest. Her wolf, previously thrashing with anger, suddenly went completely still, its attention snapping toward the center of the room. On the main floor, Silas froze. His massive shoulders stiffened. The bored, detached expression vanished from his face, replaced by a look of absolute, predatory shock. Slowly, deliberately, Silas inhaled. To the rest of the room, the scent was faint, buried under the smoke and perfumes, but to the Alpha King, it was like a lightning strike. It smelled of deep, ancient forests, petrichor after a thunderstorm, and wild, unyielding fire. It was a scent that commanded him, entirely bypassing his rational mind and speaking directly to the darkest, most primal depths of his soul. "Mate." The word echoed in the silence of the hall. Silas didn't speak it, but the sudden, terrifying shift in his aura screamed it. His icy grey eyes darkened entirely, bleeding into a solid, terrifying obsidian. Priscilla, misinterpreting his sudden stillness, took a bold step forward, reaching out to touch his arm. "Your Grace, would you care to—" A low, guttural snarl ripped from Silas's chest, so loud and ferocious that Priscilla shrieked and scrambled backward, tripping over her silver hem and falling to the stone floor. Beatrice gasped, reaching for her daughter, her face pale with terror. Silas ignored them. He wasn't looking at Priscilla. His obsidian eyes were locked onto the shadows behind the stone pillars. Genevieve's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Run!" her mind screamed. "Run!" But her legs refused to move. The invisible tether snapping tight between them had anchored her in place. Silas began to walk. The crowd parted violently before him, lords and ladies shoving each other out of the way to avoid the wrath of a newly awakened Alpha King. He bypassed the highborns in their jewels. He walked straight past the weeping Priscilla and the horrified Beatrice. He marched directly toward the servants' corridor. When he reached the pillar, he stopped. Genevieve stood there, her drab grey dress blending into the stone, her hands shaking. She looked up, meeting the terrifying gaze of the most powerful man in the kingdom. "Who are you?" Silas demanded, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with barely restrained possession. I am Genevieve, she whispered, the name slipping out before she could stop it. Beatrice, recovering her wits, pushed her way through the crowd, panic distorting her features. Your Grace, please forgive the intrusion. She is merely a servant, a disturbed Omega girl from our kitchens. She has no place here. I will have her removed instantly. Silas didn't even look at Beatrice. He simply raised one large, scarred hand. Silence. The command was laced with so much alpha power that Beatrice choked, physically unable to speak, her hands flying to her throat. Silas took the final step, invading Genevieve's personal space. The heat radiating off him was intoxicating. Slowly he reached out. Genevieve flinched, expecting a strike, but his touch was shockingly gentle. His calloused fingers brushed against her jaw, tracing the line of her cheek before tangling in the tight braid at the back of her head. With a swift pull, he snapped the pins, letting her rich, chestnut hair cascade over her shoulders in wild waves. The scent intensified, pure and undisputed. Silas reached down and took her small, work-roughened hand in his. He lifted it, pressing a kiss to her knuckles while his dark eyes remained locked on hers. She is no servant, King Silas Blackwood announced, his voice booming across the dead-silent great hall, echoing off the vaulted ceilings. And she is no Omega. He turned slowly, keeping Genevieve's hand firmly in his gaze sweeping over the terrified crowd before finally landing on the trembling forms of Beatrice and Priscilla. She is my mate, the true alpha heir of Oakhaven, and queen of the Northern Marches. Silas's lips curled into a dangerous, feral smile. Guards, seize the Lady Beatrice. It appears we have a treason to discuss. The great hall erupted into sheer chaos. The heavy silence that had suffocated the room shattered into a deafening roar of gasps, panicked whispers, and the clattering of armor as King Silas's elite guard, the Shadow Wolves, moved with terrifying precision. They surrounded Lady Beatrice and the sobbing Priscilla, their silver-tipped spears leveled at the women's throats. Treason! Beatrice shrieked, her carefully cultivated mask of aristocratic grace melting into ugly, visceral panic. She struggled against the massive guard who bound her wrists with heavy iron cuffs. This is an outrage. I am the Lady of Oakhaven. You have no proof of any crime, King Silas. You cannot simply claim a filthy servant and usurp my— I said silence, Silas growled. The command was not just loud. It carried the concussive force of an ancient alpha. The sheer atmospheric pressure of his voice forced Beatrice to her knees, her teeth clicking together as her jaw snapped shut against her will. Silas turned his attention to the grand oak doors. Bring him in. The crowd parted once more. Two northern guards dragged a whimpering, battered figure into the light of the chandeliers. It was Gideon, the corrupt apothecary of Oakhaven. His robes were torn, and he trembled violently, reeking of fear and cheap ale. Genevieve's eyes widened. She instinctively stepped closer to Silas, who immediately wrapped a heavy, possessive arm around her waist, anchoring her to his side. The warmth of his body seeped through her thin, drab dress, a stark contrast to the cold terror she had lived in for 3 years. My spies in the Southern Territories are thorough, Lady Beatrice, Silas said, his voice echoing with lethal calm. When rumors reached the north that the pure-blood daughter of the great Arthur Sterling was a defective runt, I found it highly improbable. Arthur was a legend. His bloodline does not produce Omegas. So I had my scouts look into your administration. It didn't take long to find this rat drinking away his guilt in a tavern in the Riverlands, boasting about the fortune you paid him to brew refined wolfsbane. Beatrice's face drained of all color. She looked at Gideon, her eyes wide with betrayal, but the apothecary was too busy sobbing into the stone floor to meet her gaze. You systematically poisoned an alpha heir, Silas continued, his eyes darkening to obsidian as his wolf surged at the thought of Genevieve's suffering. You attempted to destabilize a sovereign pack, and you conspired to present a false heir to the High Council. By the ancient laws of Ethelgard, the punishment for poisoning a pure blood is death. Priscilla screamed, crawling backward away from her mother. I didn't know. I swear it, Your Grace. She did it all. I am innocent. Silas looked at the trembling girl with absolute disgust. Take them to the dungeons. The High Council will formally strip them of their titles at dawn. Beatrice will face the executioner's block, and Priscilla will be exiled to the barren wastes. Oakhaven is no longer theirs. As the guards dragged the screaming women away, the lords and ladies of the court dropped to their knees, bowing deeply in absolute submission to the Alpha King. Genevieve stood frozen, her mind spinning. The nightmare that had consumed her life for 3 years had been dismantled in less than 10 minutes. Silas turned to her, the terrifying warlord melting away, replaced by a man looking at his salvation. He reached up, gently wiping a stray tear from her soot-stained cheek. You are safe now, little wolf, he murmured, his voice a low rumble meant only for her ears. No one will ever cage you again. That night, Genevieve was escorted to the royal wing of the palace. For the first time since her father's death, she bathed in hot, rose-scented water and was dressed in garments befitting her station, a gown of deep emerald velvet lined with white fur, colours of the northern marches. When she looked in the mirror, the ghost of the servant girl was gone. Her chestnut hair gleamed with health, and her amber eyes burned with the returning fire of her inner wolf. Before dawn broke, the northern procession prepared to leave the capital. Silas had no patience for the sycophantic games of the southern lords. He had found his queen, and his only desire was to bring her home to his fortress, Ironhold. The journey north was arduous but breathtaking. The royal carriage, heavily armoured and pulled by 6 massive black draft horses, rumbled over the cobblestone roads, gradually leaving the lush green valleys of the south for the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Frosthorn Mountains. Inside the carriage, wrapped in heavy furs, Genevieve and Silas began the delicate process of unravelling the bond between them. I thought I was broken, Genevieve confessed softly one evening, watching the snow fall past the carriage window. For years I couldn't feel her. My wolf. It was like living in a silent, empty house. Silas reached across the velvet seats, taking her hand. His large thumb traced the knuckles she had bruised from years of scrubbing stone floors. Wolfsbane is a cruel poison, Genevieve. It severs the tether between the human mind and the wolf spirit. But she was always there, waiting for you. He paused, his gaze intensifying. She is incredibly powerful. Even masked by the remnants of the poison, your scent brought my own wolf to its knees. I knew the moment the wind shifted in that hall. Genevieve flushed, looking down at their joined hands. What happens when we reach Ironhold? I know nothing of being a queen, Silas. I have scrubbed floors and mended torn linens. The lords of the north are hardened warriors. Will they accept a queen who hasn't even had her first shift? Silas smiled, a rare, genuine expression that made him look breathtakingly handsome. The north respects strength, true. But strength comes in many forms. You survived 3 years of psychological and physical torture, yet your spirit remained unbroken. That is the resilience of an alpha. As for your shift, when the wolfsbane is entirely purged from your blood, she will come. And when she does, the entire kingdom will bow. But as the carriage pressed deeper into the treacherous mountain passes, the shadows of the past were moving to strike. The Frosthorn Pass was a narrow, treacherous stretch of road, flanked by towering cliffs of black granite on one side and a sheer drop into a frozen gorge on the other. It was the natural border between the southern kingdoms and the northern marches, notorious for its brutal winds and hidden ravines. It was here, under the pale light of a crescent moon, that Beatrice's final, desperate contingency plan was enacted. Lord Reginald, the corrupted alpha of the Riverlands and Beatrice's secret financial backer, had known that if Silas discovered the truth, his own head would be on the chopping block. He had stationed a legion of rogue mercenaries, wolves banished from their packs for murder and savagery in the high caves of the pass, paying them handsomely to ensure the Northern King never returned home. The ambush was brutally efficient. A massive explosion of black powder shattered the quiet of the night, blowing apart the stone bridge directly ahead of the royal procession. The carriage violently jolted to a halt, the draft horses screaming as the drivers pulled hard on the reins to stop them from plunging into the abyss. "Ambush!" roared the captain of the Shadow Wolves. Before the echo of his voice could fade, dozens of massive, feral wolves poured down from the snowy cliffs. They were enormous, matted beasts, driven by bloodlust and gold. Inside the carriage, Silas moved with terrifying speed. He shoved Genevieve to the floor, covering her body with the heavy iron-reinforced wooden bench. "Stay down," he commanded, his eyes already bleeding into that deadly obsidian. "Do not leave this carriage." Silas didn't bother opening the door. He kicked it entirely off its hinges. Mid-leap, the Alpha King shifted. Genevieve watched in awe and terror as Silas transformed. He didn't just shift, he erupted. A massive night-black wolf, easily the size of a warhorse, landed on the snow. His roar shook the snow from the pine trees. He tore into the mercenary ranks like a demon of vengeance, his jaws crushing bone and armor with sickening ease. The Shadow Wolves shifted and joined their king, forming a defensive ring around the carriage. The snow quickly turned crimson as a brutal, visceral battle raged. But there were too many of them. Lord Reginald had spent a fortune. For every rogue Silas struck down, 2 more took their place. From her hiding spot, Genevieve watched a massive, scarred rogue maneuver around the flank of the royal guards. The beast's yellow eyes locked onto the open door of the carriage. He knew the Queen was inside. He stalked forward, saliva dripping from his jaws. Panic seized Genevieve, but right behind it came something else. The lingering ache in her bones, the ghost of the wolfsbane, suddenly shattered. A blinding heat ignited in her chest, rushing through her veins like molten gold. The fear evaporated, replaced by an ancient, territorial fury. "This is my mate," a voice roared in her mind. "This is my pack." The rogue lunged into the carriage, his jaws snapping for her throat. Genevieve didn't scream. She met the beast's leap, head-on. In a flash of blinding amber light, the human girl vanished. The carriage groaned under the sudden weight as a magnificent, terrifying creature took her place. Genevieve shifted. She was a breathtaking sight, a towering wolf with a coat the color of deep autumn russet, threaded with brilliant, shimmering gold. The alpha blood of Oakhaven, suppressed for years, exploded into existence with a concussive shockwave of raw power. Genevieve caught the rogue mid-air, her jaws clamping down on his thick neck. With a violent twist of her head, she threw the massive beast out of the carriage and down into the frozen gorge. She leaped out into the snow, landing with a heavy thud. She threw back her head and let out a howl. It wasn't the guttural roar of a warlord, but a clear, piercing, hauntingly beautiful call that echoed through the mountains, vibrating with absolute authority. The battlefield froze. Even the blood-crazed mercenaries stopped, their instincts suddenly screaming at them to submit. They were standing in the presence of 2 supreme alphas. Silas, his black muzzle stained with blood, turned to look at her. Through the bond, Genevieve felt his shock, followed instantly by a tidal wave of overwhelming pride and adoration. With her wolf fully awakened, Genevieve charged. She fought with the lethal grace of a dancer and the ferocity of a starved predator. Side by side, the black wolf of the north and the golden wolf of the south decimated the remaining traitors. The mercenaries who didn't fall to their claws turned and fled into the mountains, their morale shattered by the arrival of the Northern Queen. When the last of the enemies had fled, the heavy silence of the mountains returned, broken only by the panting of the surviving guards. Genevieve stood in the snow, her chest heaving. Slowly, she shifted back to her human form, collapsing to her knees as the exhaustion of her first shift caught up with her. Silas was there in an instant, shifting back and wrapping his heavy fur mantle around her shivering, naked shoulders. He pulled her against his chest, burying his face in her chestnut hair, inhaling her scent deeply. "You are magnificent," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "My beautiful, fierce queen." Genevieve looked up at him, a tired but triumphant smile gracing her lips. "I told you I was not broken." A week later, the towering black iron gates of Winterbourne, the capital of the northern marches, swung open to welcome their king. The city was a sprawling fortress of stone and steel, beautiful in its harsh, unyielding way. The coronation and mating ceremony were held under the light of the full moon in the ancient courtyard of Ironhold. Thousands of northern wolves gathered, their eyes fixed on the dais where Silas and Genevieve stood. Genevieve wore a gown of spun gold and black velvet, the ceremonial crown of the north resting upon her head. Beside her, King Silas looked prouder than any warlord who had just conquered a continent. As the high priest officially bound their souls together before the moon goddess, Silas took a silver dagger and made a small cut on his palm, pressing it against Genevieve's. "I, Silas of House Blackwood, bind my life, my pack, and my territory to Genevieve of House Stirling," he proclaimed, his voice carrying over the silent crowd. "I, Genevieve of House Stirling," she replied, her voice steady and ringing with alpha authority, "bind my life, my pack, and the lands of Oakhaven to Silas of House Blackwood. We are one." The crowd erupted into a deafening roar, shifting into their wolf forms and howling at the moon in absolute loyalty to their new king and queen. Genevieve looked out over her new people, feeling the solid, unwavering presence of her mate beside her. She had been shoved into the dirt, poisoned, and hidden in the shadows. But she had survived the darkness, and now she was the light that would lead the North into a new era. Genevieve's ascent from a poisoned, forgotten daughter to the fiercely loved Queen of the North became a legend whispered across the realms. She reclaimed Oakhaven, not with inherited privilege, but with the undeniable strength of her awakened wolf. Beside her terrifying king, she ruled with a perfect balance of brutal justice and profound compassion, proving that true alpha power is forged not in silver halls, but in the fires of survival.